Albert Einstein once said, "Reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one." One of the topics we discuss a lot on this channel is simulation, be it virtual or augmented reality, uploading human minds to computers, or simulating whole worlds. Indeed, in terms of the Fermi Paradox, we often kick around the notion that we might be living in a simulation, the simulation hypothesis or argument. In regard to that, people often debate whether we live in one or not, but here we usually say that's the wrong question, not do we live in one, but if so, does it actually matter? As we see with the Fermi Paradox, the apparent contradiction between our ancient and vast universe and its seeming absence of any other civilizations inhabiting it, the answer is basically no. If you're talented enough to make a simulation that can fool us into thinking it's real, you won't leave glaring holes in the basic structure of that universe. Which is to say, the physical laws of that simulation should have been crafted without blatantly obvious contradictions that allow no explanation for the state of affairs inside it other than to conclude it's fake. You don't include an entire universe in a simulation rather than just a planet unless the rest of the universe serves some sort of important purpose, since any such purpose could only be achieved by a civilization that has taken a heavy interest in science. It messes things up if they keep encountering paradoxes, so whatever the answer to the Fermi Paradox is, it is going to make sense in terms of the known physical laws of the universe and those emergent laws of chemistry, biology, and psychology. This will be true whether it is a simulation or not, unless the purpose of that simulation is specifically to have folks find those contradictions. That is a pretty probable case actually, one that I usually dub a Nursery Universe, and we'll discuss that later today. Debating whether or not we live in reality is not our main interest for today. Even in the episode on the simulation hypothesis, that wasn't something we focused on, as it's essentially a question you can only answer if the simulators are either idiots, which is unlikely if they can make such simulations, or actually tell you, directly or indirectly, that it's fake. In both cases, it's outside your own control. You cannot determine you are inside a simulation by any experiment you can perform inside one. Rather, our interest today is more about who might make such simulations, which is inevitably either a post-scarcity civilization or entity. Creating such a thing is intensely resource expensive, and there's almost always an easier way to achieve a goal without investing that much. So it's pretty much limited to folks who have those kind of super abundant resources. More to the point though, if you can do it, you are post-scarcity, at least as we've previously defined that, rather than the absolute sense of having no scarcity of resources at all. A common solution to the Fermi Paradox is to suggest that maybe nobody ventures out into the galaxy because they have everything at their fingertips at home. Even where normal reality might draw some limits, they can simulate almost anything they'd ever want in virtual reality. The flaw in this line of reasoning is that if you can decently simulate people well enough not to set off an uncanny valley reaction in people interacting with them for hours or even years at a time, it means your computing is so good you could easily assemble a robot to go out and explore the universe. A probe smart enough to build more copies of itself, a von Neumann probe, and able to do exploring or even resource extraction is simply child's play to any civilization able to simulate people well enough that most folks prefer virtual reality to regular reality. Complexity-wise, it's like wondering if Intel or AMD can build an abacus. And they only have to do it once. That's the point of a self-replicating machine. They are also automatically post-scarcity if they have that, because it means they have automation good enough to do virtually all the mining, farming, manufacturing, and maintenance. This is why we dismiss it as a Fermi Paradox solution. Such a civilization still has a value for raw materials, energy, and information about the universe, and even if they are terribly lazy, it requires virtually no effort for them to do this. Also, such laziness is always assumed to come after they create their utopia, which relies on that technology to exist. They may well turn into lazy vegetables, though it seems unlikely everyone would. But even so, it wouldn't matter if they do if they already launched those probes. Our focus being more on post-scarcity civilizations though, we should address this habit of assuming virtually unlimited wealth and luxury universally breeds lazy, spoiled idiots. We already have a lot of people with virtually unlimited wealth and luxury who are not lazy, spoiled, or idiotic. However, a lot of these scenarios for civilizations collapsing under their own gluttony typically only work if folks who designed the system were pretty incompetent, which, as with the aforementioned probes, runs into a causality issue. The lazy, spoiled idiocy comes after the technology and system exist, and would not affect the designers. For this reason, we can safely assume that potential problems any 10-year-old could spot will be spotted by those designers who will try to rectify them. One of the useful things about science fiction is that it can help us foresee these problems and think of solutions, to become genre savvy. As an example, we have a lot of science fiction discussing how a technology-based utopia might collapse after a few generations when the civilization forgets how to maintain the equipment. Regardless of whether or not you can solve that concern, you were certainly aware of it in advance and would have sought out a solution and implemented it if you could. Such being the case, some rather obvious ones spring to mind. Which ones you can use depends on your technology, of course. First, many of us would decline to enter something like that, a virtual utopia, just on general principle, and there's no particular reason to think such groups would die off, since they may very well have access to life extension technology, and even if they decline to use that, they can just pass their preferences on to their children. Second, those who do still take their skills with them, and it would seem unlikely they just magically warp into utterly selfish entities. But even if they did, it is clearly in their best interest to make sure the system is maintained. Third, if you've got amazingly good virtual reality, you also have every teacher's dream educational system, and it's very easy to set the system up to force an education and basic ethics on youngsters before letting them do whatever they please inside it. Fourth, it would be very plausible those folks were not entirely classically human anymore and had enhanced intelligence to make learning and remembering skills easier, or even directly downloadable as in the Matrix. Indeed, the very existence of technology good enough to simulate people plausibly enough for comfortable interaction strongly implies you can also upload minds to run on a computer or otherwise create AI, which either way now represent an effectively immortal entity who should not be forgetting things, as well as saved earlier states that could be automatically awoken even if such entities were prone to turning lazy or stupid. You just wake up the earlier version that still retains the necessary skills and dedication. Fifth, you could create a guardian caste, people or AI who had the specific maintenance job for the system and were programmed or conditioned to resist any temptation which might make them suck at their job. Now, in that vein, and of educating people, we do get a pathway to those nursery universes I mentioned earlier. One concern often expressed about high-tech civilizations is they might underbreed and die off for lack of numbers. Regardless of whether this concern is justified and scientific, and in my opinion it is neither, one has to consider that if people are turning into lazy spoiled brats, they probably would not make good parents, even assuming one would be interested in devoting the time to that. Such a civilization probably doesn't need a lot of new people to maintain population levels, as its population is likely to be functionally immortal, but they can always resort to growing kids in vats. It offends the sensibilities to suggest a machine could raise a healthy child, though considering that a lot of bright and well-adjusted kids have emerged from families that are beyond dysfunctional, I don't think the bar is necessarily that high. This is another example of causality issues with these utopias though, as the effect, lazy spoiled people, comes after they have invented the relevant technology. They are lazy and spoiled because they have access to virtual realities and automation so good you can craft simulations of people that are good enough to make them more attractive to interact with than other real people. If it can trick an adult, it can trick a 2-year-old. So before you've got people totally cutting themselves off from civilization, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, you've got machines that can raise kids. As mentioned, the notion tends to be fairly offensive to our sensibilities, and personally I'd object to using such a pathway, but there's no logical reason to think it wouldn't work, and it's certainly preferable to extinction, unless the programming is botched and produces legions of little sociopaths. But then again, if that's the alternative considered attractive enough, people are willing to employ it as an alternative to extinction, it means it's better than normal parents, either because it genuinely is, or because the available parents are content to use it in spite of its obvious flaws, implying they would probably make awful parents. Essentially, if you're willing to let a machine raise your kids, it's probably the right move. If you do have that, then you have your population issue licked, along with your colonization issue, since it means you can send probes off to terraform planets or build habitats, and then just grow and raise people when the time comes, a von Neumann colony if you would. If you can't lick that problem though, you don't actually have to use machines or virtual people, you can just use digital people instead, full-blown mind emulations. I'd imagine you could find plenty of folks with a proven track record of child rearing you could copy as much as necessary and keep that state preserved for future copying too. You can make as many copies as you want, so a volunteer could raise hundreds of kids at once and do that for centuries if the pool of decent and willing parents was too low. We'll bypass any argument of whether or not a digital copy of a human mind can be an android parent as well as a regular modern person can. I'm not being dismissive of the argument that only flesh and blood people are real, we've talked about that before, but folks who feel that way are unlikely to be inclined to go live in a virtual reality anyway. As the Nursery Universe approach, this comes down to the big difference between the simulation argument and other more classic false reality scenarios like life just being a dream. The simulation argument is specific to what are called ancestor simulations, cases where someone is simulating a past version of Earth, namely modern times. This does not necessarily mean it's identical to their own past, just that it represents a plausible alternative history. The original might have had totally different individual people, for instance. It should also be noted that not every person inside one has to be fully sentient. Technically, it just means that you have to be, since you know you're sentient, but can't be sure about anyone else, especially folks living far away from any place you've ever visited. Such a simulation could have started billions of years ago, or the year you were born, or even sooner, though that last rather eliminated the need for the specific teaching style universe. Now, the simulation argument says that we have three reasonable scenarios to consider. Option 1, such simulations simply aren't possible, either because they genuinely are not for reasons unclear to us, or they're freakishly impractical, or there's nobody alive in any civilization advanced enough to do one, like they've nuked themselves out of existence before getting the simulation tech. Option 2 is that they do have that tech, but simply have no motivation to use it for simulations, so they do it rarely or not at all. They might consider it unethical, pretty impractical, or simply have no interest. A strong AI like Skynet taking over the planet probably has no desire to invest the resources to run a simulation. The whole premise for that in The Matrix, using people for batteries, is simply ludicrous. Good movie, silly plot. The ethics one is pretty plausible though, as it's pretty hard to justify creating whole planets of essentially real people for fun or experimentation, when a virtual reality running pretty good approximations is likely to be good enough. If you want to visit the medieval era and go jousting, your opponent does not need to have hopes and dreams and emotions to try to stick a lance through you. Option 3 is that civilizations can do simulations and do them pretty often. Now, we don't have a clue which of these is true yet, or how likely each option is, so we usually apply what's called the principle of indifference, which is where you assume that the various scenarios that seem plausible are all equally likely till you have data indicating otherwise. 3 options, and each one is 1/3 as likely. In option 3, where they might have made millions of simulated universes, there is still a non-zero chance you live in the original real one. So the odds you live in a simulated universe, if those assumptions are true, would be about 33%, 1 in 3 that option 3 is right, minus a tiny probability that it is, but you are in the original reality. You or your descendants will later make simulated universes. Obviously, this is very simplified, and even if you can do this, you have to have some motive for doing so, one that justifies the huge cost compared to alternatives and which your society, or at least the simulator, considers ethical. That tends to be a short list, and one of those is the Nursery Universe approach. You want to raise kids who are reasonably ethical and social and normal, and also won't have a total nervous breakdown when plucked out of the simulation into the real world. So you pick an ancestor period close enough to your own time that they share a lot of your basic principles and familiarity with technology, but not one quite far enough along so that fake realities are obvious options to them. Similarly, a period like now still has a lot of hardships and a need for human social interaction, but not so much you'd feel guilty about it, like if you dumped people off in ancient Rome or Egypt to live as a slave. The common objection to this is that an awful lot of people nowadays lead very bad lives, but keep in mind, you can only use your own personal existence as a gauge for that hardship, as you don't know that any of those people are real. Not everyone in a simulated universe has to be sentient, just good enough to pass inspection if you meet them, and only while you're actually talking to them. After all, if you make a virtual paradise planet to live in, you aren't going to waste the processing power to make someone even match a modern chatbot when you've never met them, and they can be boosted up if you do. In such a nursery universe, you can just yank people out as they graduate, but you might do whole batches or classes, as it were, stick 100,000 people in one with 7 billion virtual folks, beginning say 1984, all of whom are 34 right now, and just end and reset the thing when all or most of them have gotten to the necessary mental development. If you want them to be mentally ready for realizing their reality isn't the real deal, you might then include some clear signs of that being the case, subtle paradoxes that make them wonder, but probably not overt enough to make it certain. I sincerely doubt it would be the Fermi Paradox, but that would be one example of how your simulated universe might have things going on inside it that weren't explainable under the apparent physical laws governing it. Now, if you do happen to have a civilization where people are prone to turning into lazy, self-absorbed jerks after a while, no matter how well you prepare them, these ancestor simulations give you a good replacement option. Once you raise a batch, you can use them to do all the maintenance on the system and grow the next batch as a way of paying their dues before entering their own personal utopia. I don't happen to find this scenario particularly plausible or ethical, but people propose this line of reasoning a lot, about post-scarcity civilizations collapsing under their own bliss and divorcing themselves from their civilization, so it is worth pursuing the concept and seeing that there's a lot of steps you can take to circumvent that. The collapse, that is, the divorcing themselves from society, is a bit harder. An awful lot of our civilization revolves around our interdependency for basic survival, and to be blunt, that's out the window for a post-scarcity civilization. Once technology hits a certain point, you don't need anyone else to live, not for basic survival needs anyway. Not a new concern there. Isaac Asimov played around with this idea with the Solarians, a planet full of people who lived in near isolation from each other, enjoying total luxury granted by their armies of robots. The planet wasn't particularly full either. As I recall, they considered their world fully populated with 20,000 people when first introduced in The Naked Sun, and had less when we see them again tens of thousands of years later as a subrace of hermaphrodites in Foundation and Earth. Incidentally, the former is a great book, while the latter is not. This doesn't mean you don't need those other people for basic social interaction and sanity though. Humans need that, and our whole existence as a technological species almost certainly derives from that basic family and tribal system. The same would also likely be true of alien civilizations, though in spite of us talking about the Fermi Paradox, this is not an episode about that. It does highlight though that while you might be able to remove that dependency through technology, you'd expect it to be the norm throughout the universe, though not necessarily universal. That dependency on social interaction to be happy and stable does provide a limited safeguard though. Much as it is possible nowadays to live without even talking to anyone face to face, few of us voluntarily do that, at least exclusively. We can at least assume people will want to interact with other real people at least until the available sims and chatbots get so good that they let most folks achieve a comfortable suspension of disbelief. The downside is that this almost certainly does not require those virtual people to be fully sentient and sapient, and our relationships with our pets pretty much prove that, though we are likely to be far more sensitive to inhuman quirks in virtual humans than we are in pets. Hence the uncanny valley. It doesn't even have to seem fully human though, for many interactions this hardly matters anyway, but the thing about a real person is that they can get on your nerves. They do have rights and feelings. They won't be in the mood to go on a trip or play a game or whatever just as you want and when you want. So a lot of times that slight inhumanity would be preferable to the real deal who is essentially unavailable. And a person's own mind is going to gloss over a lot of flaws and inconsistencies if they want it to be very real. This represents a real problem for post-scarcity civilizations, as it probably takes far less processing power to simulate a whole civilization to a comfortable level of human interaction than it takes to emulate a single human mind. Nothing is fully rendering where the person experiencing it isn't at, and everything just downgrades to minimum upkeep. I don't care if the forest I just left ceases to exist when I walk out of it, or if on returning, the trees no longer perfectly match their prior layout and leaf count, let alone if anthills have the same number of occupants, or the chemical composition of some rocks I sat on has slightly changed. If I did, such specifics could be saved, and you could just run these at levels necessary for most people to be comfortable and kick up those aspects of the virtual reality and its continuity a given individual is more sensitive to. A geologist or botanist would be more likely to notice such things and be bothered by them after all. In other words, everybody probably has these in their house, and this very same level of computational power means everything in their house is being easily cleaned and maintained by robots, as are all the farms and factories. They can easily connect to other people if they want, assuming those other people want to talk to them, but you could live your life quite comfortably as king or queen or god emperor of some realm where everyone acts plausibly enough. What's more, it would be very likely that one of the first things folks would start working on was some drug or hypnosis method or implant that made people tend to ignore flaws or forget they were in a simulation. Not to trick people, but at their own request, so they could better enjoy these vacations or retirements. You either don't remember that you're from Earth, not Westeros, or you actively don't care, your brain just kind of ignores it. Again, this doesn't prevent you colonizing other solar systems or anything, because that can be done through automation, but it does tend to mean society would start falling apart. More technology is always better, but when you get to this kind of level, you don't really need more, so you might not care that everyone has stopped doing new research or even maintenance. That said, you would tend to think a lot of folks would keep up the system as it was their passion, and those folks would probably be the best of your researchers, since passion for a topic is pretty much the biggest prerequisite to excelling at it. And you can always go that paying your dues route we discussed a little while ago, where new folks are expected to help maintain things for a while until they get to escape to a virtual utopia. And you can always require everyone wake up and be useful every so often. As mentioned, these tend to be flaws and problems everyone would notice long before you did this, so you'd expect them to prepare things to handle it. It does tend to strongly imply, though, that the way most of them would handle it would be to try to raise new members to a certain degree of ethics and responsibility in advance, rather than raising some kid in a pure virtual utopia where they are effectively a god and your whole species is composed of kids who never grew up and are used to being able to wish people away to the cornfield, like in the classic Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life. This remains one of the big issues facing any post-scarcity civilization though, that each of its members can probably exist entirely on their own because they have all the data and automation needed to see to all of their needs, and a vast archive of entertainment, classic or virtual reality, to entertain them. Such a civilization has a risk of collapsing not because its members might all die, but simply because none of them have any sense of dependency on each other. If faced with a threat, they could probably just board a spaceship they owned or had made and take off with all the information and production capacity they need to live happily on that ship or whatever destination, if any, it has. They don't even have to feel guilty about the species potentially ceasing because they are a seed quite capable of germinating a branch of us elsewhere. They can just tell their ship to stop somewhere at some point to refuel and take some extra time to set up a von Neumann colony. This requires no effort on their part after all, and was probably part of the template for such a ship they yanked out of an archive before fleeing. Not the prettiest portrait of the future, in some ways, though keep in mind that while it sounds rather horrifying in many ways, these folks are all enjoying very happy lives, and there's also no reason to think that divorcing yourself from the rest of humanity is inevitable or universal. Some folks might, some might not. I wouldn't expect everyone to go the same path. A lot of it is likely to depend on how these folks regard reality. For many folks, a simulation, no matter how good, isn't an acceptable substitute, and you could make a case that a civilization getting better at making believable realities would tend to naturally stop getting better as they lose folks to those personal paradises. Those not in them grow to dislike the idea more and more and aren't interested in further funding their improvement, and you'd expect that to happen before they reached a point where virtually everyone joined in. The same applies to regular reality too. Again, virtual reality is not the only aspect of this. A simple rise in automation catering to your every need can make folks grow divorced from reality, but as it improves and more folks do that, you'd expect to lose both your research pool for improving it, as they enjoy it themselves, and the support of those still not using it, as they dislike where it's taking people. You could have 99.99% of a civilization in such circumstances, and that still leaves you 70,000 people who aren't, by modern populations, and trillions if you're looking at a Kardashev 2 civilization. The former is more than enough to rebuild with, especially since they have all that technology still, and the latter is thousands of planets worth of people to serve as wardens and safeguards for everyone else. So again, we see a post-scarcity civilization that clearly has a lot of things going for it, but also some serious challenges too. Okay, next week we will be returning to the Fermi Paradox to discuss some of the solutions that revolve around aliens having actually visited us, particularly the notion of aliens visiting our ancestors in the distant past, in Ancient Aliens. The week after that, we'll be discussing mind uploading and some of the more interesting implications of that which often get skipped in fiction, along with our June book of the month, The Singularity Trap, the newest novel from Dennis E. Taylor, author of the excellent Barbaverse trilogy. For alerts when that and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and share it with others. And if you'd like to help support future content, you can donate to SFIA on Patreon or purchase some fun SFI merchandise, and I'll link those below. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a great week.